Welcome back to Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho. This is Magrey DeVega, our senior pastor. We're with Hyde Park United Methodist Church. And today we're going to be diving into this idea of tragedy, suffering, and evil, and its relationship to God and God's nature and God's power. Throughout this series, the other topics we've been talking about have been quite a bit more theological in mind. Not that this isn't a theological idea, but whereas we could lay out three different ways of viewing this idea and look at the history of thought and all that kind of stuff, this strikes home in a lot of ways. I mean, I think I'm going to be asking questions that are genuine and sincere questions about where is God and how do we understand God when bad things happen? And I'm going to be asking Magrey questions like, in your own pastoral ministry, what do you respond to people with when tragedy happens? Chances are you're going to have a lot of the questions that I'm asking Magrey, or you may have other questions as well. If you have questions that you want answers to, drop them in the comment section below as we dive into this conversation. So, Magrey, I thought a great way to start would be just reviewing this dilemma that you kind of laid out in the sermon, right? Between God's power, his omnipotence, God's omnibenevolence, and then the reality of tragedy, evil, and suffering in the world.
Right. It is a formula where all of the variables don't quite add up to make perfect logical sense. How can an all-powerful and an all-loving God still allow or cause suffering, evil, tragedy to exist in the world? Those components we can understand conceptually as individuals, but when you put them all together, it just doesn't make sense. Now, the formal theological word that we've adopted over church history is that this is a problem of theodicy. Theodicy coming from two root words, theo meaning God, and dike, which is a Latin word that means justice. How can the character of God that we have come to understand be reconciled with the need for justice in the world in the presence of such suffering and tragedy? So that's what, as I said in the sermon, is the impossible chess match. On the one hand, you've got omnipotence, omnibenevolence on the one hand, and then on the other side, as you said, the ever-present, deep existential recognition we all have that this world isn't right, that my life isn't right, that there are things that have happened in me and people I love that do not reconcile with a God who has all the power, causes all things to happen, who loves us. There's a disjunction there, and that disconnection causes some of the deepest existential crises in our faith. My hunch is you have been through them. I will freely suggest that I've had moments in my life where I have gone through those crises of faith. You probably have too. Mm-hmm. My hunch is that many of us are going through them right now. I remember sharing probably about 7 years ago in a sermon a story about Steve Jobs, the noted founder of Apple, who in his early years was raised in the Christian faith. And so he was going through an existential crisis about what he believed about God. His family was going to a Lutheran church at the time, so he made an appointment as a 13-year-old to go talk to his Lutheran pastor. And so he came in with this notion of God's power, God's omniscience, and God's love, and sat down across from the pastor and said, does God know how many hands I'm holding up, how many fingers I'm holding up behind my back? And the pastor responded, of course, God knows all things. God knows how many fingers you're holding up behind your back. So then Steve Jobs pulled out a copy, the recent edition of Life magazine from 1969, and slid the magazine cover across the desk so that the pastor could see that on the cover were the pictures of starving children in Nigeria and Biafra that were suffering because of the civil war that had gripped that part of the world. And so Steve Jobs said, then does God know about this? And if so, why isn't God doing anything about it? And so the pastor went through all of the theological gymnastics that I have had to do and tried to work this out, reason this out the best I could. I remember early in my ministry being just like that pastor, trying to explain it in ways that made sense. Ultimately, it doesn't make complete sense, and that's when Steve Jobs walked out of that office and decided for the rest of his life he was not going to believe in a God like that.
Yeah, and I think that's a place where a lot of people lose faith. Mm-hmm. is in this dilemma. So let's start maybe with, let's ease into it a little bit with
Sure.
kind of the story that you gave from Steve Jobs about the suffering in Nigeria,
Yeah.
right? These more institutionalized forms of evil and suffering. Nowadays, we might think of just war and dictators. In our conference in the United Methodist Church, we think a lot about anti-racism and the history of racism, Jim Crow laws, what that's done to people, how that's a form of evil. Where is God in those? Let's start there. Where is God in these more systemic types of evil that we see in our world?
Right.
And what's our response then to that?
It's a great question. So the reality is, for us as Christians, we believe in a God who sees the injustice of the world. All throughout the Bible, one of the common themes is that God sees the oppression and the oppressor, and God always sides with the oppressed. God stands on the side of those suffering from injustice. Every major episode or era in the Bible that has anything to do with systemic oppression, whether it's enslaved people in Exodus or exiled people in the prophets, or the systemic oppression that the Jewish people were going through in the Gospels, God always sides with the oppressed, recognizing the disparity of power that exists in systemic oppression. So it's not that God is blind to it. It's not that God caused it, but it's clear where God sides on each of these things. And as a result, it's clear how God wants to initiate power to resist against those things. The thing I think about when we mention these systemic issues is our baptismal vows.
Yeah.
Do you promise to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? Here's the reality of that moment. When that question is asked of any person, whether it's the parents of a child or the baptized person themselves or anyone who joins the church, it is not a coercive question. We're not forcing people to say yes. In fact, in my conversations with anybody who's going to be baptized or join the church, we tell people the choice to say yes to that and the other questions is yours and yours alone. So it's the idea here that God is persuading us, influencing us to do all of those things, to stand up against systemic injustice. It's our choice to say yes. Unfortunately, the world is filled with evidence of people who've chosen otherwise, to choose to be complicit or silent in the face of systemic injustice. So it's not that God is powerless. It's that God is always, like in every moment, exacting a kind of influential power so that we can cooperate with it to address those things.
Okay. So then if we move kind of to the tougher stuff, right? I'm just going to ask you as a pastor.
Yeah.
What do you don't have to think about, I'm not going to give you an example of a tragedy, but like what do you say to families when something tragic happens, right? When you're in that hospital room or you're by that bedside or you're with the grieving family before a funeral. How have you done that theological work in your own ministry to kind of understand where God is in that? And then what's the comfort that you give to those families with your words?
I think what's important for me to remember in moments like that is that those kinds of crises, personal, tragic, suffering moments are not always the best setting to have high-level theological discussions.
Right. You're not going to unpack that passage in Jeremiah where God says, I know the plans I have.
That's right. That's right.
I understand.
What's important in that moment is to lean in to the way they're processing that moment, and for me to be open and receptive to whatever language they are offering to describe that situation. So I am not in a position, if they say something like, God's got a purpose in this, or I know God is allowing me to experience this for a reason, or why is God doing this? I always feel honored that they would entrust me with the language that they are able to give to that moment. And it could be that down the road, as time passes and the intensity of that suffering abates enough to where they can invite me into a place of doing deeper theological reflection. That's the time, not for me to tell them other options or to guide them into other ways of seeing it, but to be with them in that moment, and when appropriate, just offer some alternatives. So, in other words, it's not in the hospital setting, it's not in the family funeral consultation that I ever offer theological alternatives. More often than not, it's in an email that someone sends me at 3:00 in the morning to say I'm struggling with this. Or it's in my office when they make a special appointment to say, I've really been wrestling with this. Those are the moments when I feel very privileged by their invitation, not by my intrusion, to say, maybe God didn't cause that to happen. Maybe God's there in a different kind of way. Or maybe what God is doing is identifying with you in this moment, and that's exactly what you need. Or maybe God is stirring up something within you to do something about this. There are no simple, generic answers to cover all situations. The important thing as a pastoral person is to be a pastor first and to meet people where they are.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think that's one of the beautiful things that we're doing in these conversations. And what I want you to hear is whether you've had a way of thinking about this or you think about this differently than we do right now, even just listening to this conversation, us willing to reflect on this, might spur you to think about it differently the next time. What just popped into my head is how, 3 or 4 months ago, I was just dealing with something, and someone who I really look up to said, you know what you should try sometime? You should give yourself 15 minutes to feel the feelings. Just set a timer for 15 minutes, feel the feelings. And then see how you feel after those 15 minutes and try and move on. Not move on and forget about what you were feeling, but just allow yourself to get all those feelings out.
Awesome.
Emotionally. And then go about your day. Because what I would describe is I'm feeling locked up. I'm just feeling like the emotions keep me locked up. And something happened this week that allowed me to actually put that into practice. And it was beautiful in the way that I cried, I experienced it for 15 minutes, and then I was actually able to focus on what I needed to do the rest of the day. Not forget about the tragedy, but focus at least, and not feel like I was locked in that tragedy. And that really has nothing to do necessarily with suffering and evil. But the reason I share it is because what we say here may not connect with you in this moment with what you're going through, but maybe it's a model that somewhere down the road in 3 to 6 months, you might, instead of thinking that God has a plan, you might think God is just with me. God is suffering alongside me. God's right here.
So these are questions that are central to our existence as human beings. The things you're going through that you're articulating on behalf of lots of other people are at the core of who we are. This is now week 4 of this Hard to Believe series. I doubt that you go through any given day wrestling with the Trinitarian nature of God, or how Jesus could be fully human or fully divine, or how God could be all places. But what we really wrestle with is the hurt, the harm, the suffering that we're going through and that of others. So the idea of pausing, centering yourself, if I may frame this biblically for a minute, it is no coincidence, I think, that in the very center of our Bible, like literally in the central pages of our Bible, is a conversation that is happening about this very thing. Matt knows better than I do about what wisdom literature is. The wisdom literature is that conversation about the reality of God and the reality of suffering coexisting with each other. On the one hand, you've got Proverbs, and you've got this idea that if we just do the right things, then it'll all work out.
It's bumper stickers.
Bumper sticker stuff.
That's what
God has a purpose for everything. There is a reason for all this. We just need to choose the right things, and we'll be okay. On the other hand, there is this internal conversation partner with Lamentations and with Psalms who are saying, why? This doesn't make sense. The world is upside down. What is going on? So the Bible is literally having a conversation within itself, just like you have. That 15 minutes. And overarching all of this is a weird conversation partner called Ecclesiastes, who has basically resigned itself to, why are we even wrestling over this? None of it really matters. So if you've ever had an internal conversation among yourself, where part of you is Proverbs, the other part of you is Lamentations and Psalms, And at the end, you're just like, come on, Ecclesiastes, vanity of vanities. That's biblically modeled for us.
Yeah.
It's permission giving. And your notion of just taking a breath and breathing it out and allowing you to feel what you're feeling is modeled for us biblically.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think that sometimes what's modeled in the culture, especially for men, is don't feel those feelings.
Don't feel those things. Right.
Like,
right.
Hold it in. Be stronger. So let's bring this to a close. So so reiterate the 3 points from your sermon,
Sure.
I think, because I think those are foundational for people who are trying to build this new model of really walking with God through these tough times.
Sure. Number 1, God does not cause suffering. Number 2, God is with us in our suffering. Number 3, God transforms our suffering. I think those 3 elements are, again, also framed biblically for us, beginning with the story of the first sin, the first enmity, which is a word meaning division or separation, both between us and God and us and our intended life, comes right back to the Garden of Eden. God did not force human beings to be obedient. God set a framework in which humans could choose the right thing, in the hopes that that choice itself was formative and shaping of who we can be. But it formed a division. It introduced sin. It formed enmity. But God did not cause it. God's placement of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden does not mean that God was complicit in creating the possibility of sin. It was actually a gift for us to have the choice to choose right, which would be formative for us. So God does not cause our suffering. Much of the Bible is a story about how God didn't abandon us, that from the very beginning of the garden all the way through the biblical narrative, God was with the people of God through the worst of times, and then ultimately with us in the incarnation of Jesus. So God is with you in your suffering. And then it's the cross. The story, the pivotal story in the Bible for us as Christians is that not only did God identify with us by suffering on the cross, God transformed it into new possibility and new hope. The cross is the pivotal factor in all this. I once had a fellow board of ordained ministry person who was evaluating questions with me on this theodicy question. She said, I don't see how any candidate for ministry could answer the question of suffering and evil without mentioning the cross in their answer. It's an inescapable reality for us as Christians. It names human suffering, and that names the hope. That's what happened in the cross.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Magrey.
Yeah.
And thank you for joining us. I hope you found this helpful, and hope you share it with a friend if they might find this helpful as well. We'll see you next time.